Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Lemercier, so I work at NVIDIA now, mostly on diffusion for language modeling, so not on audio anymore. So if I have some things which are slightly outdated in this presentation, please feel free to let me know. But before that, I was at the University of Hamburg with Professor Gagman doing my PhD on diffusion for speech restoration, in particular to speech reverberation, but also in general for speech restoration. So here I will present some things I did during my PhD, some collaboration with Eloy as well, and some things that were done at the same time by NVIDIA, very much related work. So I think it was thought it was interesting to just put the two in conjunction, and so let's get into it. I'll mostly talk about diffusion for speech restoration, but I guess also some variants of diffusion. So Schrödinger bridges, flow matching, and so on. So that was mostly done at NVIDIA last year and 2 years ago. And something that I did at University of Hamburg was this hybrid predictive generative speech restoration, and it was also picked up by some people at NVIDIA last year. So also talk about that. And the last bit is model-based unsupervised speech reverberation, and that's something we did with Eloy Moliner over there. So basically, just a word about what the context is. So we work on speech signals, and in particular, we try and enhance speech that is degraded by many perturbances like competing speakers, background noise, music, etc. And the goal is to make the speech as clean as possible for applications like smart home devices or any commercial applications, but also very importantly hearing aids. And if you think of hearing aids and all these embedded devices, they have a very limited computing power, battery life, and so on. So basically all of the things that you can, all these easy scenarios where you can think speech enhancement has been solved, because it's true, a lot of these tasks have been kind of solved, but you have to consider more the actual context where we use these technologies, which is limited computing power, limited memory, limited battery life, and so on. And then it becomes a little bit complicated, and you have to think even before model compression, all these things. You have to think a bit in advance, how to take that into account in your research. And also you have to consider also pretty extreme scenarios that happen in our daily life, very low signal to noise ratio scenarios where you have a lot of background noise, a lot of reverberation, some clipping, etc. So that these things happen more often that we actually notice it, because I'll talk for myself, but hopefully most of you have a normal hearing, and we don't notice that because we can just process that very easily ourselves. But people with hearing disabilities, that's really another story, and you have to go the extra mile to have a better quality of life in general. Just a very quick insight into what a typical speech restoration pipeline looks like. So you have your polluted speech at the entrance, this waveform representation. You go through some kind of encoder or any representation that you would like to use. In speech, there's a lot of STFT, so a short time Fourier transform involved. And you have your neural model in the middle, and then you do your inverse or pseudo-inverse transformation, and you have your clean waveform at the end, right? And now the question is what is in this green box? In this green box, you can have predictive models, for instance. So these are really the classical models that we find everywhere with a deterministic input-to-output mapping. You train that with pointwise losses and mean square error or anything. And the nice thing is that you have a deterministic output, you have no hallucination or whatsoever, but you have other types of artifacts, and a lot of them are caused by the training objective itself. You have very limited coverage of your target data, but it still works pretty well. So you have a successful examples like SC Mamba, DF Conformer, DMUX for source separation in music, and so on. And on the other hand, you have generative models, right? So different training objective here, we directly try to parameterize the target probability distribution, so either implicitly or explicitly, depending on which model you choose. And recently, model has been very successful is diffusion in general, right? And here you can have like either stochastic or deterministic output, depending on which solver you use at inference time. And that comes with like some hallucination issues that we observe in general in generative models for text, for audio, for anything. And we have identified that this happens a lot in low signal-to-noise ratio scenarios, for instance. So here I will talk about like flow matching, the Schrödinger bridge, which are like some examples of like diffusion or diffusion variance, if you will. And finally, you can also try and consider like hybrid models, right? So how to combine predictive with generative to kind of balance the artifacts, computational budget. So I'll talk a bit more specifically about that in the second part of the talk. Yeah, so first part, just like to talk about two diffusion variants for speech restoration here, so Schrödinger bridge and flow matching, and what has been done at NVIDIA with that. So basically, if you consider like the classical diffusion process, if you will, so you transform data to noise, right? You add Gaussian noise on top of your data, you transform it into like a very noisy distribution. So that's what we call here like this data to noise process. But you can also consider different processes like Schrödinger bridge, for instance, where it's actually more flexible in terms of which terminating distributions you use, right? So like if P0 is your data distribution and Pt is your fully corrupted distribution, with Schrödinger bridge, you can flexibly choose any distribution you want for Pt. For Gaussian diffusion, it's not the case. It has to be Gaussian-like. So that we'll see that it can be interesting in some cases. So what happens like for Schrödinger bridge or for like other the diffusion like models, you have your clean data x0, you have your corrupted data, it can be anything. In this case, we consider, for instance, like the actual corrupted input we're gonna give to our models at inference time. So like speech plus noise, for instance. And you sample an intermediary point in the middle of your trajectory. That's your xt here. So that basically represents like your clean data plus some corruption, right? It can be like some Gaussian noise, some reverberation, whatever. Then you pass this corrupted input to your model, along with the original corrupted input, this y. Also some time conditioning, just to let the model know actually what the amount of noise is in the amount of corruption in your current xt, and you try and predict the clean speech out of that, right? So that's what we call like this data prediction mode, where we directly we do not try to learn like the noise or like any other quantity, but read directly like the clean speech. It's interesting because that enables us to introduce some inductive biases in there, because we know that some losses are interesting for speech signals. For instance, like you can use like a classical MSE loss, but you can also introduce perceptual losses, like other distortion-free losses, like a lot of different things are adapted to speech signals, like also in the spectrum domain, etc. And so you train your model to do that, so essentially to denoise and decorrupt like at various noise levels, right? At inference time, you basically sample an initial point, so you can choose that point however you like, but has to match your terminating distribution, right? So your fully corrupted distribution. In our case, like Schrödinger bridge allows us to use y, so like the corrupted speech input without like any Gaussian noise or anything. And we pass that to the neural model, and we have an iterative solver that basically progressively denoises and removes some corruption in the input, right? And when we like the results that we have here is like on speech enhancements or like on pure denoising actually. We observe that like the predictive baseline is just like it's one step denoising, if you will, right? Like you just have like the corrupted speech input at the input of the model, and you directly spit out like an estimate of the clean speech, right? And it's basically good like at word error rate, which just like tells you how good you can transcribe your data to text, your speech to text, and how much of an error is there like in the transcription. So it's pretty good because it doesn't hallucinate, so you can really see it here, like it's one of the best baselines, if you will. And if you consider like the pure, like original diffusion model, the quality is pretty good. So PASA actually measures like speech quality. It's not too bad, but like if you look at what error rates, then it's not great. And the reason for that is basically that it hallucinates. So like the model that would transcribe the speech to text will make some errors, and that is reflected in this metric here. With Schrödinger bridge, actually you have like, in this setup you have like kind of the best of the two approaches. So it's a diffusion variant, but the fact that you train your model to exactly terminate the process at the corrupted speech input just reduces that mismatch between inference and training, and that's one of the reasons why we have like such better performance here. I can play some examples. So that's like for denoising. That's the noisy input. Just wanna. Where's the volume control? Just don't wanna destroy your ears in case it's a bit loud. I don't know these actually. Do you know where the?
You have to use it. Can you use here?
Oh yeah, nice.
260.
Great. That was the input. That's the output.
Chi-0 was at 5,000, 260, period.
Right, and that's for reverberant input.
The transaction requires approval of a majority of the shares of the holders not affiliated with Mr. Icahn. The transaction requires approval of a majority of the shares of the holders not affiliated with Mr. Icahn.
Right. If it cuts a little bit, that's actually not the audio. It's probably like the presentation. So you have to trust me on that. Right. So that's for Schrödinger bridge, and I will just like go quickly over flow matching because it's pretty close. But the advantage with flow matching is yet another like formulation of diffusion-like generative modeling. But there's this interesting case where it's like called optimal transport flow matching, and basically instead of like here we have vanilla diffusion where you like add some noise but you don't really control like the curvature of your trajectory, right? So it can have like a large curvature like this, whereas for the optimal transport flow matching, you basically include it in your corruption process that it linearly interpolates between your starting point and your end point. The interesting property about that is that if you try and directly learn the what we call the velocity field, right? So like basically the velocity along the trajectory between here x0 and x1, for instance. If you perfectly know that, like learn that, if it's constant and it's constant speed and constant direction, then basically you can like denoise in one step, right? Because it has like no curvature, it's perfectly linear, so you make in theory no truncature error in your solver. So that's something that we are really interested in, because like at inference time, if you can generate that in one step, that's like the best thing you can get. So for that, we build on an existing baseline, which is called speech flow. It was pretty popular like in 24. And here they make an extra step, which is that they leverage a large clean speech data set to pre-train their flow matching model. And the way to do that is kind of like in this, like master SSL, self-supervised learning fashion, where they basically mask some of the clean speech data and say that, okay, this is your corrupted input, learn to reconstruct your data. And then when you post-train, so you have like your pre-trained model, and then you post-train, you switch this mask condition to whatever you want to fine-tune your model to. So it can be, here in this case, it's like bandwidth reduced input, but it could be like reverberant input, noisy input, whatever. And basically the pre-training allows you to be more robust and to learn, to fine-tune quicker. And also to leverage like unlabeled clean speech data sets. So like the modifications that we brought to this thing was to use a different domain. So like in speech flow, they use like a MEL domain, so then you have to perform like vocoding on top of that. because you don't have like phase estimation. So here they did it like in a compressed TFT domain, so you have like no vocoder for generation, and also like some tricks like for introducing the time embedding. Now we use like adaptive lane normalization, which has been picked up pretty much everywhere in Diffusion as well, to the extent of my knowledge. Yeah, so just that actually helped like the performance, and then did like a more elaborate study on different types of corruptions. So here I can just like show you, I think like the most interesting part is like the comparison between the proposed and the proposed without pre-train. And you really see that basically like all the scores are better if you pre-train in advance, which really shows you, okay, like leveraging this clean speech data is actually really interesting. And if you consider like scaling up models, that's definitely like really an essential part. So that's like the ground truth.
In addition, banks are being pushed by regulators to boost their capital positions.
In addition, banks and Venmo have been pushed by regulators to boost their capital positions.
And there is so output.
In addition, banks and Venmo are being pushed by regulators to boost their capital positions.
So even here, like it's an interesting example where even like for normal hearing listeners, like you can't understand anything that was said in the input, right? We are pretty bad at reconstructing, like at guessing high frequencies, especially because here it's like band limited to 1 kilohertz, and that's pretty extreme. And here the model reconstructs like enough so that you perfectly understand the output. Here's with speech separation, sorry.
Otherwise, Paul should have
storm coming on.
Grace from God the Father and peace from our Lord Jesus Christ.
And this is the output like for the first speaker.
There's a heavy storm coming on, I cried, pointing towards the horizon.
Otherwise, Paul should have written, Grace from God the Father and peace from our Lord Jesus Christ.
So there's still like a little bit of mixing between the channels, but like given the conditions, not too bad. Right. So a few of the modifications that were brought after that, like for flow matching based models, was to basically introduce the information of the corrupted speech input in the trajectory, in the diffusion trajectory, like in the same fashion. So here basically we replicate everything that we did for the Schrödinger bridge. So like introducing the corrupted speech input in the trajectory. So you directly go between your clean speech and your corrupted speech. Before that, it was just like any corruption. We again use like data predictions. We directly learn the clean speech, which allows us to again inject inductive biases, and also like in the Schrödinger bridge, we are also able to start the generation from a sample which has like only speech corruptions and no Gaussian noise on top of that. And so basically all of these different steps really help for instance, denoising. And the nice thing is here, like the main difference with the Schrödinger bridge now is that we do one-step diffusion, right? And that's the main thing. Like that was kind of the promise from flow matching in the beginning, that if we have like a linear interpolant, we just like, we can go one step, and it does work, and it works better than like diffusion or Schrödinger bridge with 50 steps. So here it's pretty interesting. The thing is now, since we don't have like this, this pre-training, we introduced the corrupted speech input in the diffusion trajectory. We cannot use pre-training anymore. So it means that it's hard to transfer like a model to any distortion. You have to make like more large-scale training and so on. So that's a limitation that also comes with that. So yeah. Right. So that was like for the different diffusion variants. And here I would talk about like something which is more important for me, like given the PhD experience, which is this hybridization between predictive and generative models. So as I mentioned it like already in the introduction, but basically predictive models, like you directly map to a statistic of your distribution, or posterior distribution of clean speech knowing your corrupted speech input. And if you train with the MSE loss, you can directly show that what you learn is the posterior mean, so like the mean of the posterior distribution. But the problem is like if you have like a weird shaped distribution like that one, the mean is not the mode, and so for instance if you have two modes in your data, then the mean is not a good statistic for learning your distribution, right? You're not like actually on the data manifold within me. And that can lead to all sorts of problems, like we all notice, like in audio, in the audio domain, that leads to over-denoising artifacts and the loss of high frequency resolution, etc. But it's fast, right? Like you do one step and you're there, right? For diffusion, and that's for, we talk about flow matching, etc. But like, let's say, the classical diffusion models, you have like to use multiple steps, but at least at some point you end up on a sample which is supposed to be on the data manifold, right? And the idea that we had like was, okay, can we actually combine that? Because there are like weird artifacts in both, right? In the predictive, you have like the over-denoising artifacts. In the generative, you have like some whispering effects, like some hallucinations. And it's slow, right? But it's still like better quality than the predictive. So the idea is that, okay, maybe like the mean is not great, but it's still much better than what we had in the beginning, right? And it only costs one step of diffusion, so like one model call. So the idea is really like very simple. It's that, okay, let's go to the mean first, and then from there, let's try and diffuse from the posterior mean to our data manifold. And that's what we call this stochastic regeneration model here. And basically, so you first pass your like your corrupted speech input to a predictor model. You have like predictive output, which has like some artifacts, and it's basically supposed to represent your posterior mean. And you add some noise on top of that just to have a diffusion process that goes directly to a sample of your distribution. You might say, okay, yeah, but it's annoying because then we add another step. So instead of having like 50 steps, now we have like 51 steps. But of course, the good news is that you actually can use fewer steps. So here it's just like some audio examples. There's a clean one.
That's because even high cache levels can run out quickly, period. That's because even high cache levels can run out quickly, period. That's because high cache levels can run out quickly, period.
So that's a predictive output, and that's the most tricky one because like if you're not really used to it, you cannot notice, but there's a lot of like muffled sound, and like you actually lose a lot of high frequency resolution. And the generative one, you have like some weird effects you'll notice.
That's because even high cache levels can run out quickly, period.
So again, you have to be used to it to actually notice them, but like there's comes some whispering sounds and like breathing sounds like at the same time as like the speech, which makes it rather unnatural. And so that's the...
That's because even high cache levels can run out quickly, period.
Right. And as I said, okay, normally you have like 50 steps plus one, so like not interesting, but what we notice is that using this extra step in the beginning just allows you to diffuse with much fewer steps. So what we have here is, for instance, the red curve is with our method, Storm, and we don't use any like second order correction. So it means that we only use like 21 function evaluations, and we get like quality and like noise removal performance, which is much better than what we obtain with the pure generative baseline, even with 50 steps, with a second order correction, etc. Right? So it's really worth it to just perform modeling that way, because in the end it's going to be interesting in terms of inference speed and quality. Right. Just a quick word about what it also like another potential combination of predictive and generative modeling. So here, like it's NVIDIA submission to the Urgent Challenge from last year. So the Urgent Challenge is supposed to tackle like general universal speech enhancement. So it's like a lot of different conditions, like corruption, sampling rates in the input, etc. And so like 2 years ago, like NVIDIA proposed like a Mamba-based solution, like a predictive baseline, which is based on Mamba. And last year they did like modify that version to use a hybrid model. So like the classical Mamba solution was just like, okay, we use a SDFT encoder with some compression in the magnitude domain, and then like all these TF Mamba layers are basically we perform like a Mamba, so like space modeling along the time dimension. Then we reshape the vector, and we perform like a state space modeling along the frequency dimension, and just like stack these layers. And it works like reasonably well. This one I'm gonna have issues because this one is aggressive.
Tear weight is often published upon the sides of railway cars and transport vehicles. Tear weight is often published upon the sides of railway cars and transport vehicles.
Sorry about that one. Yeah, so it was a pretty extreme scenario, as you've noticed. And it's like able to retrieve it, which is like, I mean, to my experience, is one of the most impressive restoration examples actually. And the new thing in 24 was to have a generative branch as well. So you use the same architecture, but like the input is different, right? Because you give your corrupted speech input, but you also give your XT, right, which is your partially corrupted input. And you also add some adaptive layer normalization to condition your layers on the noise level, so like this T parameter here. So, and you use a flow matching training objective. So like this optimal transport flow matching, which is like a linear interpolation. And it's interesting to analyze like what comes out of each branch, because that's your distorted input, and like this is your regressive or predictive model, and you see that basically where data is missing, so in the high frequencies, for instance, since it's a bandwidth reduced examples, it just like tries to interpolate, like extrapolate some of the high frequencies like from the low frequencies, but it's nonsense, right? And also like in the packet losses, in the packet loss regions, it's just like let's create whatever, because it's not a generative approach, so it cannot do like so much. And in the generative output, you actually get a lot of problems like extra like hallucinations in the regions where there's a lot of interferences. So here there's like a lot of noise here, and like the generative model struggles to actually remove all of that noise because it's more conservative. So the idea was really to just make a very simple criterion, which is just VAD based, and that worked surprisingly well. So basically where you have no voice activity, like in time frequency spectrum, you just plug your the output of your generative branch, and when there's like a signal above like the VAD threshold, you use your predictive branch, and that's just like put the two together and you have the output of this method, and that's actually working much better than the predictive output approach. So in this challenge, or like in the urgent challenge 24, it's called second in the metrics-based phase. So it performed reasonably well. Right, I'll jump into the last part, which is model-based and supervised speech dereverberation. So in this case, we do not do only like speech dereverberation, but we also try and model, try and learn like the room impulse response. So here is really like tailored to speech dereverberation, and basically the room impulse response is supposed to be like if we are in this room and I do like a clap like this, you hear like all the tail and the decays of the energy in the room, and it's basically what this room impulse response represents. And if you have like access to this, you can actually properly model the acoustic properties and the reverberation model. And the idea is like, okay, now the challenge is from a reverberant input, we try and remove the reverberation, but also learn the room impulse response. So it's a very ill-posed problem, actually. Because each problem, like separately, is ill-posed, but this one is even worse. Right, so basically why unsupervised? Which is like, because unsupervised is another layer of complexity, right? Like basically, a lot of models out there like that perform really well are supervised. So they directly train usually like a regression-based objective, but it can be like something else between paired data pairs, right? Like you have like your clean anechoic speech, clean speech, and your reverberant speech, and basically you fit one and you have a target for your model. So it's very effective, very straightforward, but you have to have high quality annotations for your data, or in the case of audio, most of the time it's simulated, right? And then you run into some issues because simulations can go not always all the way, because you have to have very high quality simulation and to take into account a lot of different physical properties, and that can be very tricky to simulate. And whenever you have an acoustic condition, like in your real inference case, that doesn't match what you have seen in the training data set, then you're kind of screwed. So unsupervised learning, on the other hand, in our case, we consider only clean speech. So we have never seen reverberation during training, and what we do all of the reverberation at inference time. What we have is a prior on clean anechoic speech, which in this case is a diffusion model, and we basically use that to guide our generation. So the nice thing is that you don't need paired data, only need clean speech. But so far, the methods that we saw with Eloy had very limited performance. Because of course it's much harder problem. So the way we do it here is we just decompose the posterior distribution that we are trying to sample from, right? So clean speech given reverberant speech, and we decompose that using Bayes in the likelihood term and the prior term. So the prior term is basically your clean speech distribution, and the likelihood is a measure of how good, how likely is the reverberant measurement that you have given the corresponding clean speech example, right? So basically, these parameters, the psi parameters, are supposed to represent the reverberation operator. So the way you have to choose basically a parameterization for this reverberation operator. So what we did is that a true model would be a convolution between in a time domain between your clean speech and the room impulse response, but we don't have access to that. And the thing is in the time domain, it's very hard to parameterize a room impulse response, because it's a 10K samples or something like that. It's very high dimensional and actually tricky to have a model in the time domain for that. But if we go to the time frequency domain, this has much more structure there. In particular, you can use a model that basically tell in each frequency band, I use one parameter to quantify the overall energy in this frequency band, and one parameter to characterize the speed of the decay of this energy in a frequency band. So how fast the energy disappears in this frequency channel. And so that's our reverberation operator. So there's a decreasing exponential envelope in the magnitude in the time frequency magnitude domain, and the phases, we don't really have a good model for phase at this point, so we just let them free and we just optimize them. So the likelihood model that we have is basically a distance, which is this C function here is a distance function between the reverberant measurement, which is the thing we have access to, and our reverberation operator applied to the clean speech, right? And the thing that you have to keep in mind that we do not know the psi parameters and we do not know the x0. So we have to see how to estimate that. That's what comes next. So that's the thing. So basically, a diffusion model, in this case we consider score-based, score parameterized diffusion models. What you have normally is that you try and take gradient steps along the direction of your log probability to go to your most likely to your most likely speech examples, or data examples in general. And the thing is, if you only consider the prior, which is just clean speech, you will only go in distributions, only go in solutions that are in the distribution of clean speech data. But you have no idea about the actual reverberant measurement, right? You haven't haven't introduced that at all. So the idea is that you add a second term, which is this likelihood parameter, and you take gradient steps along that direction as well, right? So you basically balance the two so that you have at the same time, at the end, a solution which is in distribution in terms like of clean speech distribution, but also which is consistent with your reverberation, reverberant measurement. So that basically it goes like this formula like here is basically take the log and the gradient operator of base, right? If I just take the one right here, we take the logarithm, we take the gradient, and we obtain that one, right? Right. So now, of course, like if we have like the parameters for the reverberation operator, we can just run that, right? And we have access to a clean speech prior, which is our diffusion model. We have our parameters, and we just like run a gradient descent, and everything's fine. The thing is, we do not have access to the parameters. We also need to estimate the parameters on top of that. And the true optimization problem is actually intractable, because you need to evaluate the expectation given your posterior distribution of your log likelihood term, and you maximize the parameters. You maximize this quantity with respect to the parameters. It's not tractable because of this expectation here, because we do not have access to the true posterior. So we use an expectation maximization framework, which is like a classical solution. So you basically alternate between two steps. You first estimate your expectation, and then you maximize, and then you go again, right? And instead of having a joint optimization problem, we just like decompose it in alternating steps. So the way we approximate the expectation operator is really simple. We just take one Monte Carlo sample. It's almost cheating, but everyone does it, and it works pretty well. So we basically have an estimate of our clean speech, which is given by our diffusion model, and we just apply the likelihood term to that particular model with the current estimate of the parameters that we have. And then at the next step, at the maximization step, we optimize the operator parameters psi with a simple like gradient descent algorithm like Adam or anything, or SGE or whatever, right? So you do that, right? You alternate between expectation, so estimation of the quantity in the bracket or like in red, and then maximizing on top of that. So in the end, it makes up a like pretty complex algorithm that I will try to summarize here. Basically, you start off from a very noisy speech example, because we use Gaussian diffusion in this example. So we start like from reverberant input plus like a ton of Gaussian noise to be as close as to a standard Gaussian as possible. And we initialize the room impulse response parameters with just some random stuff. I mean, it's not random, it's not very informative. It's actually a very dry room here. And then at every step, what we do is first of all, we go through our unconditional speech prior, which is our score model. We take like a denoising step to obtain a clean speech estimate, x0, which is supposed to be close enough to what we want at the end, like our dereverberated output. We plug that in the likelihood term. So we plug the current parameters, the current clean speech estimate, and we evaluate the likelihood term such that we can optimize the parameters, and we can also run the gradient descent for the posterior score. So basically, the branch on top, what we call reverse diffusion here, you see that we add like unconditional score and the posterior score, right? So in the end, we try and sample from that distribution, from the posterior distribution. And for optimizing the rule of response parameters, we use this expectation maximization framework. Right, and if you run it like long enough, hopefully you get something which is good, right? Right, so how does it actually work in practice? The answer is not too bad. But if you compare to supervised algorithms, it's tough, right? Because supervised algorithms have a crazy good training signal, which is given by the supervised objective. but there are some cases where it's interesting to make a comparison. So in this case, we have like what we call match scenario, where basically the supervised baselines that we have, the PSE here is like a like a predictive baseline, and the SGNSC plus is a diffusion-based baseline. And you train them with like paired, anechoic, and reverberant data pairs. And here you evaluated, we evaluated that with reverberant examples that are in distribution, right? So like it's a held out test set, but are still like in the same kind of distribution. In the mismatch setting, we use like completely different room impulse responses. Like we actually, in this case, we use simulated room impulse responses, whereas like in the match case, in a training data set, it's real room impulse responses recorded. And we see that basically, if we go from that scenario to that scenario, like the overall performance for like the yellow and the brownish algorithms like takes a hit, right? Whereas for all the unsupervised algorithms, it stays relatively the same, right? So WP is an example, RVA-EM is a VA-based expectation maximization framework, and our thing buddy is in green here. And you see that from one scenario to the other, it almost doesn't change because it's unsupervised, so it doesn't have like this notion of like what is matched on, what is unmatched, right? Because it has not seen any reverberation during training. Right, so the nice thing is like, okay, we can seamlessly adapt to new acoustic conditions, but also we largely outperformed the existing unsupervised methods. And that was like the good thing here. And I can show that in the examples as well.
When the sunlight strikes raindrops in the air, they act as a prism and form a rainbow. When the sunlight strikes raindrops in the air, they act as a prism and form a rainbow.
So that's, the next one is the VAE-based one.
When the sunlight strikes raindrops in the air, they act as a prism and form a rainbow.
That was the predictive one, sorry. That's the VAE-based one.
When the sunlight strikes raindrops in the air, they act as a prism and form a rainbow.
So it has still like a lot of reverberation in there. It's very hard to notice because we are in a slightly reverberant room, so it's always complicated to show these examples. Maybe one of the worst tasks for demonstration actually, but this is the output of our algorithm.
When the sunlight strikes raindrops in the air, they act as a prism and form a rainbow.
Right. And so we've talked about speech reverberation performance, but what about room impulse response estimation? Because that was one of the promises also like from introduction, right? Here we basically take one acoustic estimator, which is a T60, which is a reverberation time. So basically the time it takes for the energy to go from 0, if we just normalize 0 dB to minus 60 dB. So like the longer it is, like the more reverberant your room is, right? And so if you are able to estimate that from your room impulse response, it means that your room impulse response is correct, so to say, right? If you match the two. And basically, so FINS here is a supervised algorithm which is able to predict the T60 in each octave band from the reverberant speech. And our approach is Buddy also does the same thing, but without any supervision or training time. And you see that basically in the match case, they kind of like almost the same, a little bit worse in the high frequencies. And in the mismatch case, like Buddy outperforms the supervised method like almost everywhere as well. Right, so I'll actually jump to global conclusions. So like in the first part, I talked about like various diffusion variants for speech restoration. So I mentioned the Schrödinger bridge and the flow matching method. We proposed like some adaptations of the training objective. For instance, like introduce like the information of the corruption in the diffusion process, like the corruption process, using a data prediction loss to introduce some speech inductive biases. generative pre-training, etc. And we show that we are able to like increase the quality compared to like the vanilla diffusion, but also to significantly accelerate like the sampling. And especially for the flow matching method, we are able to perform one-step generation and still retain a very high quality. For the hybrid predictive generative part, basically we've showed that there are some specific problems in each category of models, and the idea is that if we find like some optimal combinations, some are worse than others, the two that we presented are pretty efficient in the sense that they can avoid some of the problems in each method. And so we, like in the case of the stochastic regeneration model, we are really able to accelerate the inference and still have like an improved quality. And presented like another type of combination, like another example for this universal speech enhancement challenge. And finally, like the last part was about model like unsupervised speech tree reverberation, right? And we presented a method that's like using a diffusion model for the clean speech prior and like this sub-band filter reverberation operator I described for the estimating the room impulse response parameters. And we show that we are able to jointly estimate these two quantities and that we obtain like much better results than the existing unsupervised baselines in a purely blind single channel setting. Right, so that's it for me, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much. So, questions?
Yeah, a couple of questions. You were showing a table where you were putting, no, don't worry, you don't have to go to the table. Just for my understanding, you were comparing multi-step flow matching with one single step where you were getting better results. Is this with classifier free guidance?
No, the one you mentioned is like so it's between like one-step flow matching and Schrödinger bridge or like diffusion. So it's not the same model basically.
Okay.
So like if you like in the case of, we don't show it here, but basically in the case of flow matching, if you use one step or if you use 10 steps, you'll have almost the same performance because like you have learned this like linear trajectory. Yeah.
Because, but if you do one step, you can not really exploit that much anymore the classifier free guidance that has been shown to boost a lot of quality, no? So I wonder how do you, I don't know, maybe auto guidance or things like this, but I don't know.
Yeah, in this case, like it's like this model was like fully supervised, so there was not like the dropout like for the classifier free guide, like to enable classifier free guidance. I guess it's like you can also use like some self-conditioning. I think if you do like only one step, it's also, I'm not sure if it's that relevant, but you can do it, but then you have to estimate, like you have to run your model twice. I'm not sure exactly how effective it is like for
well, there is this thing of auto guidance that you shrink, you have like a shrinked version of your running model. And it just shares the same inductive biases, and in principle your second step is much.
Yeah, you mean like for self-conditioning or like
exactly.
It's a good question. I have actually no idea how like that performs in that case.
And about the Schrödinger bridges, if I was not, I mean I heard the term and so on, but I was not super familiar, just out of curiosity. Like it's similar to rectified flow, but you just swap your target distribution is not the your source distribution is not it's not a Gaussian, but it is your actual target. No, so you go from one distribution to the other. So this,
I think for rectified flow, it would be like for flow matching, like this optimal transport flow matching would be the closest to rectified flow. For Schrödinger bridge, it's a bit different. So basically, for Schrödinger bridge, I haven't shown like the math here, but basically for Schrödinger bridge, what you have is like you model the score for both the forward and the reverse term. So basically, what you have in diffusion is that you know how to run your forward process without like estimating any score function or anything. And like you pay the price at the reverse process and you try and estimate like the whole score function in there. And like in Schrödinger bridge, you actually decompose that score term in a forward and a reverse process. And like the mathematical framework allows you to have like using these two things you basically can have like a different terminating distribution than just a Gaussian. So that's like really the only thing you really win with the Schrödinger bridge is the flexibility of the terminating distributions, and also like some training dynamics probably like it's a bit more smooth, but I also think it has some relationship with the terminating distribution actually.
Okay, but it's not just as simple as changing your interpolant instead of being a Gaussian, your actual target. Right?
Yeah, I know. Like training objective is
it's
a bit different.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was wondering, how are these compatible with classifier free guidance techniques and these things, or?
I think so. Because you like since you estimate like a score function, you should be able to also like drop the conditioning. I haven't tried that either, but I think it should be. Yeah.
Okay, because your conditioning now is not anymore a conditioning, no? It's the target distribution, or your source distribution in this case. I mean, you don't like how you will be dropping the actual what it would have been the noise in a normal diffusion process, no?
Yeah, well, like in this case, like like for classifier free guidance, here we consider like supervised models, right? Like where you have like conditional input, like which is this corrupted speech input. So you just drop out this channel, so to say, right? You replace it with just like zeros or like masks or anything, right?
But in the case of Schrödinger bridges, this is actually, if I understood correctly, this is not anymore it's a condition, it's your source distribution.
It's both, right?
So dropping it makes any sense?
Yeah, because like it will still be introduced. It will be in the training objective still, right? Like in the form of the supervision, but it's just like not in the input of your neural model anymore, right? So that's like the classifier free guidance is only related to what you give to your model. And in this case, like you'll still be able to map to your training objective, like to your training target. Yeah.
So I had a question about also the Schrödinger bridge. So the idea is that like if you have something that it's already like subject to a corruption process, that is not necessarily Gaussian, like something that is I don't know, a tape was damaged, and then you can use that directly as your sort of noisy distribution and then try to map back to click, right?
Yeah, you mean your corrupted? Not necessarily just so noisy, but anything.
My question is like, how do you actually estimate the time variable for your starting point? Do you always start it at the sort of Tmax, regardless of how actually corrupt the thing that you want to do at test time is?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question because basically it completely depends on how you do your training data, right? So basically, since you consider like paired examples and you don't have like a global time variable, right? You just say, okay, I have like something bad, something clean, and the something bad is like t=1, something clean is t=0. But it could be like what you mentioned, indeed. Like for instance, you have something which is like an example which is a little bit noisy, and another one which is like super noisy, and both have like t=1, right? So in this case, like if you don't do like anything fancy, basically you will always ask your model to. You will basically regress to the mean of all that, right? So you ask your model to do a task which is like not very optimal. If I guess you could structure your data set like, or just like condition your data set in a manner like your time embedding actually represents one would be like mapped to the worst example that you have, right? But the thing is, if you have like multiple corruptions, what is it, right? Like, how do you measure? Like, do you only use signal to noise ratio? I guess like that's the most likely thing that you can use. But like different corruptions, like signal to noise ratio is very noise or like a additive noise related metric in the end, right? So if you try to use like signal to noise ratio or like signal to corruption ratio to measure like how bad is something clipped or how bad is something bandwidth reduced, then it's pretty weird. So
so right now for my thesis messing with a class of models that's essentially the optimal transport models that you mentioned, but they sort of drop the time conditioning and instead they sort of adjust the magnitude of the vector so there's not constant anymore. And you end up with something that essentially tries to do like a gradient landscape so that you have like equilibrium at minimum.
What do you mean, like the magnitudes of the of the vectors?
So
which
in
vectors?
optimal transport, right? Like you have the vector pointing you to the data is the straight
The velocity field.
Data, right?
Yeah.
Now, as you walk down the line, you are still regressing that full vector.
Mm-hmm.
The idea here is don't regress the full vector, just regress what is left over. So
Yeah, but
it becomes sort of smaller as you get close to the data point, and you have like a gradient sort of behavior where like the closer you are to data, the smaller magnitude of that the model outputs.
But that's just, I mean, to me, like this just depends on your solver, right? Like if
so
you use an
things
adaptive
like
solver, it will
because
automatically.
you have like that, you are not constrained to integrate it over one. You can integrate with a various like gradient descent on whatever's like what you want. In the paper that I was sort of following, that is for images, but I think it could also probably apply. You can actually just run a gradient descent however many steps you want, but you don't need the time conditioning because it has this sort of equilibrium dynamics where it just tries to sort of converge to a local minimum.
And your model has like good enough like conditioning signals at training time that it allows the model to actually know when to stop, or because that's the thing with the time embedding, right?
So you pass, like the way that I'm doing is you pass sort of the clean data to the model and it will give you a gradient that will be really small. I just run the optimization process until I get roughly to that gradient level, and I usually get good samples.
Okay, but then like so you have like to accordingly like scale your data such that like the gradient magnitude like for all like the when you get close to the clean example like
it will always be zero.
Yeah,
like,
okay.
Like on clean data, the gradient is ideally zero because you are linear. So I was just wondering if you think that sort of like time invariant field that it's sort of it just like it came out like a couple months ago. It might be useful to sort of get rid of this problem of sort of trying to estimate the actual noise that you're throwing in as an input.
There was something actually about that. There was something where they basically were directly estimating like the SNR like as a part of the training objective as well to actually avoid that problem, or like it's not avoiding the problem but like having a model learn more basically. So it does work, and I think I mean like for instance like right now I work like on diffusion for text for instance, and basically here there like you let your model learn how corrupted the text is, which is much easier because you have like masks instead, so that completely destroy the information instead of like partially corrupting it. But I don't know, like I think like estimating the SNR, like estimating the optimal target, like when to stop and so on, like between training and inference you can always find ways to do that. Adaptive solvers, like for inference, conditioning signals without training time.
Oh, thank you again.